Thank you very much, Prem, for setting the tone for the Cafemutual Ideas Fest 2021. And absolutely, I'm sure many of us are equally excited about understanding what's exactly in store for the future. And I believe that we're going to have a befitting start with a befitting speaker joining us right away, because I know many of us had the opportunity to hear him on several occasions, but it's truly an honor to have his presence right here at the Cafemutual Ideas Fest 2021. Before I invite him, let me also urge all our members of the audience, all our attendees, don't forget to keep tweeting or sharing your thoughts using hashtag CIF21. With that, I believe it's time to understand the state of the Indian economy and where it is headed. A very pertinent question on all of our minds for a very long time. Now, joining us, before I invite him and introduce him, we do understand that the Indian economy has shown a V-shaped recovery due to its quick response to COVID. And to decode the recent growth-oriented budget, we have with us none other than Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, who is a principal economic advisor in the Ministry of Finance, in order to tell us as to where the economy is actually headed. Now, we all know that he's a recipient of many, many accolades and awards. He was named Young Global Leader for 2010 by the World Economic Forum in Davos, an honor that was given to select individuals below the age of 40 for outstanding contributions across disciplines, including politics, academia, sports, business, and art. He's a Rhodes Scholar 1992 to 95 and was also awarded the Eisenhower Fellowship in 2007 for his work on urban systems. In 2008, CNBC profiled him as a young Turk in recognition to his contributions to Asia's financial markets. The Singapore government honored him as a young leader 2014 at the World Cities Summit in June 2014. So on that note, let's have a befitting start as I now invite our first esteemed speaker, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, Principal Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance, Government of India.
Yes, hello everyone. Pleasure to be able to speak to all of you. It's obviously been a tumultuous year, and as you can imagine, everybody in the world has had a tough time. But I think those who are managing both health systems and economic systems have had a particularly difficult years. And what I'm going to try and do in the next few minutes is perhaps give you a flavor of how the decision making is done under these kinds of circumstances when things have been, the normal calculations have been basically thrown out of the window and you're dealing with radical uncertainty. So my idea here will be to try and give you a flavor of why we took certain decisions, and also that will give you also a sense of the kinds of decisions we may take in the future. And hopefully I will be able to convince you that the kinds of decisions we took at the time that we took it were based on a certain framework of thinking that has proved to be quite a successful one in now that the results are there for everybody to see. So in order to understand our intellectual framework, you need to go back to last March so that you get a flavor of the kind of sort of how we responded to certain events as they unfolded. So rather than give you a long list of various steps we took, you will get an understanding of the thinking process, so to speak, of how we went about it. So let's go back to last March. When this whole thing was beginning to bubble up, what information did we actually have? The information we had was that something terrible had happened in China, and that it was now beginning to spread to Italy and was killing a lot of people in Italy. We were never very sure what exactly happened in China. In fact, we still don't know. But we could see that in Europe, it was spreading quickly and was causing havoc and was spreading to other countries. So like many other countries, we decided that we were going to ask experts for what they thought we should do. And so we talked to various epidemiologists and virus experts. I'm sure many other countries in the world did the same thing. And basically we got a very wide range of outcomes, from people who talked about the fact that it was not much worse than a bad flu, to people who said that, look, you should now be prepared for hundreds of millions of people being infected, and maybe there'll be millions of deaths in India alone. So now different countries took different approaches with this information, because I'm sure they all got similar range of outcomes. And some countries decided that, look, this is particularly the most likely, the most sensible sounding path that will happen. And they went down those paths. That's how you got, the Swedish model, and then there was the German model, and so on. Then other countries decided that they were going to go for herd immunity. That was what the UK wanted to do initially. Then they changed their mind. Singapore did something and then changed its mind as well, and so on. Now, the problem here in India is that we knew that we could not change our mind. Whatever path we were going to go down, we were going to have to stick with it. With 1.35 billion people, you can't change your mind. So what do? The one thing we did understand, however, is that even the experts didn't know how this thing is going to pan out. So when you are dealing with that situation where there's complete uncertainty, what do? Now, many of you are from the financial industry. You will know what one way to deal with financial uncertainty of this kind is to use something called a barbell strategy. What is a barbell strategy? Well, it's used, by the way, very often in derivatives markets, but other parts of the financial system also use them quite routinely. But basically, a barbell strategy is one in which you use two opposing strategies to deal with radical uncertainty. So this is what we did. We hedged for the worst on one hand, and we then, on a Bayesian basis, updated ourselves going forward on the other. So this is the combination of barbell strategies that we used, and we used it for both the health strategy and for the economic strategy. So if you look at the health strategy, what did we do? We did a big lockdown in the beginning. Why did we do a lockdown in the beginning? Was it because we were sure exactly how things were panning out? No, we didn't. That is precisely why we were doing it, because we were hedging for the very worst. Just in case it turned out that this was something that was going to kill millions of people, then that's the best sensible thing to do. It also gave us some time to get some quarantining in place, some testing in place, understand from the experience of other countries which were further up the value chain of the cycle, to what is it that what they were facing before we faced it. So it was buying ourselves time. That was what we were doing. And then as time passed, we began to get some sense of the nature of this disease. The fact that, oxygen levels is important. After all, I had never heard of oximeters before, but then I bought myself one, as I'm sure many of you did. How testing is done became routine, and so on and so forth. Various protocols came through. We figured out that this was not dangerous to everybody, but particularly to certain demographics, it was particularly dangerous, and so on and so forth. So we got a sense of how to go about it, and this allowed us to respond. And step by step, we opened things up. So we were, by the way, because as we became more confident, we were able to even keep opening things up in September when things were peaking. And of course, since then, we have continued to open things up. And right now, as things stand, other than a few areas like international travel and so on, we have opened up most of the economy. The same strategy was used, incidentally, for the economic side. When the lockdowns were introduced, it is not like we didn't know that there would be a shock to the economic activity. It's obvious that there would be one. I mean, that's the whole point. So those of you who thought that, we were shocked by the minus 24 GDP growth rate for that quarter, we weren't. We expected, in fact, there to be a massive shrinkage, and there was. That is obvious. But then many experts then advised us that we should be carrying out, in order to to get past this, to have very large stimulus packages, grand stimulus packages to reinflate the economy as soon as possible. Now notice, we didn't take that path at all. Other countries did, we did not. Why? Because we took the call that the problem was not that the demand had collapsed. The problem is that we had shut down supply. So if we had inflated the system at that point in time, we would not only have used up resources, we would have just fed inflation. So therefore, what we did is we held ourselves back and we used the resources we were spending in a targeted way to provide a cushion to the system, not to reinflate the system, but to provide a cushion to the system. So that's the context in which we rolled out the world's largest food program to 800 million people. Up to November, they were given free food. We rolled out Jan Dhan accounts, were given money transfers, not large amounts of money, but just enough to keep things going. For the business sector, we provided 100% loan guarantees to the MSME sector. We pushed back various financial deadlines. We put in abeyance the insolvency and bankruptcy code because we didn't want a cascade of defaults coming through. And therefore, we basically cushioned the system. Notice that even we were not claiming to be reflating the economy because there was no point in reinflating an economy that had been deliberately shut down. Now, by September, when we were beginning on the health front, becoming more confident, we began to change tack. And from there on, we began to, if you notice, do much more targeted towards reinflating demand. And so we did a series of medium-sized packages rather than very big packages. We did medium-sized series of them, culminating, of course, in the budget that you had now. And what was the focus? The focus there was on using capital expenditure, particularly in infrastructure, to reinflate demand at a time where the economy had been opened up enough and the supply side could respond. And also you were seeing some of the pent-up demand from the consumer side also coming in. So in October, we ramped up capital expenditure by 129% year-on-year. November, 249% year-on-year. December, 62% year-on-year. What are we doing? We are basically ramping up cash flow through the system and creating demand at the time that the economy is able to absorb it. And the economy responded. We have literally had the fastest revival of any country in the world coming through. And that then we have culminated that into what you saw in the budget, where we formalize that forward over the next several years. So people talk about what we have talked about the next budget, but as the finance minister said, we are actually not returning back to the old trajectory of the fiscal deficit for 3 years. So we are committing to spending over a period of time. And specifically, we are spending on creating infrastructure. Why are we doing this? For 2 reasons. One, because we want to create assets. After all, we are running up debts to do this expansion. We must create assets to match it. Otherwise, future generations will be left with the debt, but not the assets. So we decided we are going to go with the assets. Secondly, we know from experience that infrastructure spending is a good way to get employment going in particular, but also demand for cement, steel, and many products. So both of those were very important approaches we have adopted and will sustain over some time, not just for this year. It is important here to notice the difference with what other countries did, which focused purely on trying to stimulate demand through consumption, and therefore they use stimulus checks and other things. We have decided not to use that path consciously. The other big difference with other countries' approaches is that we have decided to go for a supply side approach as well on creating large number of structural reforms, which is quite different from what other countries did. We are literally the only country that has done so many structural supply side reforms during the last 10 months. And many of them are aimed at essentially getting factor markets becoming more flexible and adaptable. That's an obvious why we want that. We want that because the post-COVID world is not a reinflation of the pre-COVID world. We need to be flexible as a country, as an economy, to be able to deal with the new challenges and opportunities of this world. There'll be new geopolitics, there'll be new supply chains, new products, technologies, all kinds of new things will happen. And our factor markets need to be flexible. One of the major problems in the past has been rigid factor markets, which do not allow us to adapt to the opportunities that emerge. And so we, after years, in fact, decades of debate, have finally got new labor laws. There are 4 codes which have got our labor laws in place. We have put in place, new farm laws. Yes, there is some debate about the exact nature of it, but frankly, we are committed to doing this. These reforms on the farm farm sector has been debated for 20 years. There is no self-respecting economist has ever argued against them. There can be a debate on the political side, but every economist worth his salt has always argued in favor of these reforms for 20 years. And in fact, in the latest economic survey, there is a long list of virtually who's who of the field of economics who has argued in economic surveys of the past, commissions, reports of all kinds, arguing for exactly the kind of reforms that we have done. In fact, many political parties had also argued for these reforms in the past. So we remain committed to them, even if some minor adjustments need to be made, in order to help some groups that may be getting hurt by some specific provision, but the overall thrust of it remains. We have similarly removed all kinds of old regulations on various sectors, such as the OSP regulations for BPO and IT sector. And we have now in the budget also argued for privatization, except in certain key strategic sectors where we will retain certain amount of public sector presence. We are willing to open it up and go for full-fledged privatization. We, as you may have noticed, do not use the word disinvestment. We are not apologetic about this. We will use the word privatization. So that is basically the approach we have taken. We are very pleased that it has got good response from the citizens at large, and specifically financial markets and other stakeholders like corporate sector, and of course the general population also. Virtually everybody I've talked to, common citizens, have been very, very positively inclined towards it. Before I end, let me say that there were many things that were advised to us along the way, including some US-based economists who were very keen on trying to propagate that we should have higher taxes. As you may have noticed, we have not done that, because we feel that bringing back the animal spirits of the private sector is a very important part of what we want to do. With that, let me stop and hand it back.
Hi, Sanjeev. Thank you for such an articulate this thing. Now, some of the things that we were wanting to look forward to hearing from you, I want to ask you very pointed questions. COVID has certainly pushed back many things. Where do we stand on our progress towards the 5 trillion economy landmark?
Well, it may have been delayed a little bit, but I think it will not delay too much. So let me explain myself.
Please.
So we obviously will probably see a minus 7.5% GDP growth contraction in this financial year. Well, that's already in the, it's already happened. But I think the revival from it will be very, very strong. In the budget documents, we have gone for a 14% nominal GDP growth rate, which includes a real GDP growth rate of 10%. And a 4% inflation. But frankly, I think we will more than outdo that number. That's my frank opinion. And in fact, in the economic survey, which I co-author, we have a higher number, 15%, 15.3% in nominal GDP growth rates, which includes an 11% real GDP growth rate. But even that, by the way, is weaker than what the IMF is now saying. It's about 11.5% real GDP growth rate. So they are looking at almost 16% nominal GDP growth rate. Remember that $5 trillion number is ultimately a nominal number.
Yeah.
So when we are talking about the growth coming back, I think growth is coming back much more strongly than people realize. And don't have to take my word for it. Just look at company earnings, just look at sales of virtually every product. In fact, the sectors which are not doing so well are the ones where we have deliberately held them back on the supply side because of COVID reasons, like airlines or something like that. But virtually any sector we open back, demand is not a constraint. And we will ourselves be building out demand from, as we mentioned, we will retain expansionary fiscal stance for a period of time. So I think we will see our economy go back to sort of normalcy much faster than people realize. And I think there is a lot of momentum. So maybe there'll be a little bit of a delay, but I think the delay will not be very much.
Okay, thank you, Sanjeev. Now, the other thing we wanted to understand, clearly the first and foremost priority of the government is to kind of ensure that the economy achieves its potential growth of, right now, you said something like 14-15%. But what are the other initiatives? You talked about, land reforms and, you talked about labor reforms, you talked about reforms in other this thing. What are the other priorities which you think is on the mind of this government, which will help us achieve and maintain this rate of growth in future?
So I think one area that we are very keen on is deregulation. If you read the economic sector, the economic survey, there is a chapter 6, which you should read quite carefully, where we have talked about administrative reform, but a particular kind of part of the administrative reform, which is on process. So let me explain. You see, one of the reasons we are over-regulated is a philosophical failure that we as a country have, and this is very much embedded into our intellectual life, our bureaucratic life, or whatever. This thinking is very embedded, and which is this, that good regulation is one where we have worked out every single possible outcome and have got, said what should happen in all these circumstances. Now, this approach and thinking is embedded in everything. By the way, this is also true of the way we design our cities. We are one of the most meticulous planners of cities. Like, our thinking is Chandigarh is a good city. I mean, nowhere else in the world would Chandigarh be considered a successful city, but in India, we consider it a successful city. Why? Because it was meticulously planned and we have stuck to that plan. So whenever things go wrong in India, we'll say, plan acha tha, lekin implementation acha nahi tha. So the thinking here is that we must have an ex-ante grand plan or an ex-ante regulation. And if it is detailed enough, then we will always win. So it's a matter of but unfortunately it fails every time. For the same reason, our hockey team has a problem. We do good dribbling, but never get the ball into the goal. And we have improved recently, but that used to be our problem at least in the 80s and 90s, that used to be a problem. Why? Because we confuse meticulousness with robustness of regulation. You see, the problem is we don't live in a world with known outcomes. There are multiple outcomes we can go into, and since the world going forward is unknown, no regulation can ever be complete by definition. And so, in our attempt to create ever more detailed regulation, what we end up doing is having more and more complicated regulation. Whereas what we really want to do is regulation that is simple and flexible. And you allow discretion to the decision maker. The moment I say discretion, I would say, oh my God, discretion is being given here, as if it's a bad thing. Actually, no, there's no choice about giving discretion in a complex and uncertain world. And having more detailed regulations does not in any way reduce the amount of discretion, because what happens actually will never fall neatly into any of the outcomes you're saying. So in fact, the decision maker has more discretion with complicated regulations than he has less, because now he can choose which regulation to apply on you. And this is what happens in India all the time. And it's the root cause of all kinds of problems, from bureaucratic delays to rent seeking. So the solution ultimately is to have very simple regulation and then to have transparency about how decisions are making. So this is what I have argued in there. And this is a big, important sort of thrust area for us over the next couple of years.
Well, that's fantastic to know, because clearly you've hit the nail on the head and identified the right problem. Thank you so much, Sanjeev, for being with us. And it was a pleasure to have you with us. And yeah, so hand it over to Kavya to keep the proceedings going. Thank you, Sanjeev.
Thank you.